All right. I think we'll get started. Welcome, everyone. Today's topic is the ultimate guide to placing a medical device on the UK market. Very excited to speak to you all about this today. Before we get started, please be sure your audio is on mute. And you can add your questions via the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. We will try to answer those as we go along. If not, we'll get to them at the end. And of course, if we're unable to get to them completely, we will follow up with you via email. I'm Kelly Stanton, and I'm the head of quality here at Qualio, and I work for Qualio. What is Qualio, you might ask? We are a cloud-based quality management system software tool for life science companies. We have customers all around the world. Our tool is set up to support you in your journey from a quality system perspective. And if you want more information on Qualio, do reach out. Happy to provide some more information to you along the way. As I said, I'm Kelly, and I'm the head of quality here at Qualio. I come from the life sciences industry myself. I've got 24 years of experience doing quality systems across medical device and pharmaceuticals. And with me today is Andrew Whitton. Andrew, would you introduce yourself, please?
Thanks, Kelly. So like Kelly said, I'm the Managing Director at Insight Regulatory. At Insight Regulatory, we help a range of medical device manufacturers with their compliance needs. For example, by obtaining regulatory approvals, establishing quality management systems, helping them develop the design of their device, and designing clinical studies. We also offer UK responsible person and European authorised representative services. But personally, I've been working within medical devices for about 20 years. Mostly within senior regulatory affairs roles at a range of different companies. But for the last 5 years, I've been working in consultancy. I've covered a large range of different medical devices in IVDs, but I also have an engineering doctorate in medical devices, and with that had a specific focus on vascular implants.
Thank you for that. So today, what are we going to cover? So UK versus EU, what's the difference? I think we've all been wondering what that's going to look like since Brexit happened several years back. And finally, we have some good insights on that we'll share with you today. What are some key steps to getting your products in market in the UK? Timing and tactics for those things, some additional tips and best practices for meeting those requirements. And then hopefully, again, at the end, we'll have some time for discussion and Q&A. So UK versus the EU, what's the difference?
Great. Okay, so in terms of the UK versus EU, as a lot of you will know, until quite recently, the UK was part of the EU, but effectively left at the end of 2020. So it's still worth considering the UK medical device regulatory requirements in the context of the EU regulations. So in this part of the presentation, we'll be talking about the differences. Start off with, in terms of marketing plans, normally the UK features relatively high up on most companies' marketing plans. We can go to the next slide. And as you'll see here, UK market is a lot smaller in terms of population and healthcare spending than the EU, but in terms of the fact that there's such a close connection and such a big overlap in regulatory requirements, it's definitely worth considering the UK from a marketing plan perspective. So if we go to the next slide, please. So to start off with, we have a poll question. It's hopefully quite a simple one, and it is, if we can bring it up. So it is, what's the difference between the UK and Great Britain? So we need one choice, and the three potential answers are UK. Number one is UK includes Northern Ireland. The second one is UK includes Ireland. And the third one is nothing, there's no difference there. They are the same thing. So I'll give you a few seconds to give your answers, and then we'll have a look at the results.
All right, we're getting close there.
Okay, brilliant. Okay, that's a good answer. So yeah, most of the people are right. It's the first choice. So UK includes Northern Ireland. And if we jump to the next slide, we'll go into that in a little bit more detail. So you can see that the map here zoomed in on British Isles. So we've got on the left of it, we've got Great Britain, which includes England, Scotland, and Wales. But in terms of the UK, United Kingdom, that's Great Britain plus Northern Ireland. Going on back to what I was saying before, so when the UK left the EU, there was the Northern Ireland Protocol, which was agreed between the UK and the EU, and that was to ensure that there was no hard border between Northern Ireland and Ireland, which is still within the EU. That means that Northern Ireland still follows many of the EU rules, including those for medical devices. So in Northern Ireland, the EU MDR and the EU IVDR still must be followed. But however, in Great Britain, so England, Scotland and Wales, the UK MDR applies. Excuse me. So in fact, the UK MDR is a little bit of a misnomer, as it doesn't apply to the whole of the UK, really only to Great Britain. And as the EU MDR and IVDR have been covered in webinars, and in other webinars, most of the rest of this presentation will be focusing on placing devices in on the Great Britain market, and any additional requirements for Northern Ireland in particular. So we can go to the next slide, please. So as a bit of an overview of the UK MDR, because the UK used to be a member of the EU, the UK device regulations are actually based on the implementation of the EU device legislation, which was in force at the time when the UK left the EU, so that's at the end of 2020. And those were the 3 medical device directives that were in force in the EU at the time. So that's the Active Implantable Device Directive, the General Medical Device Directive, and the In Vitro Diagnostic IVD Directive. So those 3. However, changes to the UK MDR, which came into force at the point when the UK left the EU, were relatively minor and really mostly focused on ensuring the continued functioning of the UK regulatory system, and to distinguish it from the EU system. So changes to the system, include things like changing CE marking to UKCA or UK conformity assessment or conformity assessed marking, changing approved bodies, changing notified bodies to approved bodies. Some devices, or most devices, need to be registered with the MHRA, and instead of authorised reps that were needed in the EU, we have UK responsible persons who were needed for the UK. But however, other than this, the rules essentially are the same as the old EU medical device directives. So for those of you who have gone or who are going through the transition from the MDD to the MDR, or the EU MDR, or from the IVD directive to the IVD regulations in the EU, it's perhaps best to think of the changes that are required for compliance with EU MDR as the opposite of the changes you're just making to go to the EU MDR for that transition. In addition, as new EU regulations built on the requirements of the old directive, following the new regulations in many areas means you automatically would be following the UK requirements, but it's definitely not the case in every case, in every area. So go to the next slide again. But at this point, also as part of the Brexit transition, CE-marked devices, CE-marked medical devices and IVDs are allowed to be placed on the Great Britain market until a later date. So currently there's 2 ways to place a medical device on the Great Britain market. There's the CE marking route and the UKCA marking route as well. However, only the CE marking is allowed for placing the device on the EU or Northern Ireland markets. But products can be placed on those markets if they're both dual labeled with CE marking and UKCA marking. In terms of,
as I say, and we had a quick question, is there any movement around MDSAP certification being recognized in the UK, or UK maybe becoming part of that collective?
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, so we'll cover that a little bit later on, but there's, in terms of the new regulations that that the UK government are working on, which are due to be, I'll cover that in the next slide actually, due to be implemented in 2024, there's one of the proposals has been that a greater reliance on approvals being given across the world, and things like MDSAP, will be used to speed market access and sort of have alignment with other, I think we call trusted regulatory authorities. So very much on that subject. So with regard to how long the devices with CE marking will be allowed to be placed on the Great Britain market, until quite recently, this was due to end on the 30th of June next year, 2023. But last month, the UK government announced it will be extending this for deadline for a year until the 30th of June 2024. As changes to UK MDR are planned for the 1st of July 2024. But in addition to this, and along with what I was just saying in terms of proposals for the new regulations, the government has also provided feedback on the consultation process for the new regulations. On the changes to the UK MDR, to say that they intend to extend the time periods over which devices which just have the CE marking will be allowed to be placed on the Great Britain market, and that will be beyond the effective dates of the new UK regulations. So proposals, as you see in these two boxes here, are either 3 years or 5 years beyond that effective date of the new regulations, the new UK MDR. So for CE marked devices under the EU MDR or the IVDR, that will be 5 years from that effective date, so taking us into 2029. But for devices, general devices under the Medical Device Directive or the Active Implantable Medical Device Directive, that will be till 2027, and IVDs under the IVD Directive will be 2029 as well. So that there's one caveat as well, a little bit like with the transition period into the MDR, there's not allowed to be any significant design changes to the device during that period, but there's also no requirement, or proposed to be no requirement, for devices having to be placed on the market before the date of the new regulations, so July 2024. So it's somewhat contradictory potentially, but that's the proposed. And like I'm saying, at this point, this transition period is just proposed at this point, but yeah, it's generally considered quite likely to be at least this. So yeah, and that's sort of generally where we are now. So the next slide will look specifically at the process for UK MDR compliance and obtaining UKCA mark. So we generally have 5 steps we think we've got on the next stage, very much again like CE marking process as well. Main 5 steps we've got here, creating regulatory strategy, and then depending on the conformity assessment route chosen, you may need a quality management system. You'll always need technical documentation or technical file. And then if anything other than the lowest risk devices, you need a approved body approval, very much like an HI body approval, a declaration of conformity to the UK MDR, and then MHRA registration before placing the products on the market. So as a first step, if we look at the regulatory strategy, so the first step isn't technically required by the UK MDR, but it really is essential in order to ensure that the route to compliance is simple, cost-effective, and as risk-free as possible. So from our perspective, for all new product developments that we work on, we'd strongly recommend a regulatory strategy be produced pretty much every time we'd work on that in that area. And pretty much every time we've done one, we've been able to make sure that the sort of faster or cheaper route has been taken to get to market. But generally, a regulatory strategy would cover the things that are listed here. So, for example, is the product a medical device? Does it come under the scope of the UK MDR? Does it come under stricter rules like is it a medicinal product, or other rules like is it just a general product that isn't covered by the MDR? Sometimes tweaks to the device or the intended purpose might change where how the product is regulated, and could be put in a more favorable position. We also look at if there's other legislation that's applicable, like ROSE, for example, for electronic devices. We'd also look at what risk classification the product has. I mean, that has an absolutely massive effect on the route to market. Whether an approved body is needed, and the sort of level of detail we go to with a lot of the development work. Again, with this, small tweaks to the intended purpose or design can have an effect on the classification. And sometimes, launching a product under a lower classification, getting it on the market that way, and then expanding potentially the intended purpose and getting approval for higher classification. That can be quite a good strategy and a good way to get to market. Also, it's important to bear in mind the risk classification in Great Britain at the moment under the UK MDR may not be the same as it is under the EU legislation at this point. And again, tying in with the next point, a lower classification potentially in Great Britain, usually with something like software or an IVD, might be a good indication that launching in Great Britain first, then moving into Europe later on, when clinical data have been sort of strengthened, could be a good way to get to market as well. As I said before, EU regulatory requirements cover and go beyond the UK MDR. So following EU regulatory requirements in some areas can avoid duplication by using them for EU MDR and UK MDR compliance. So the regulatory strategy should also be used to consider the types of product verification and validation that are needed. Alongside this, which standards should be followed to work on those areas. And lastly, and perhaps most importantly, there's a strategy for collecting clinical data. For example, can we rely on equivalence, or could clinical data from other countries be leveraged? But at this point, I'll hand over to Kelly to discuss the requirements for a quality management system.
Thank you, Andrew. Yeah, so as you probably know, when you're dealing with CE marking or the new UK marking process, you have to have a quality management system in place as well. That can be done in parallel, but generally must be done before you attempt to get your technical files submitted and cleared. And so if we leverage 13485 as a baseline for quality management systems, the various countries around the world, even if they have individual country requirements, the base elements of a QMS are still going to be very, very common. So things like document control training, management responsibility, your resource management, risk, of course, being huge across your entire QMS and your product, your risk assessment and risk management processes, product realization. So what documentation are you generating as you move your product towards market clearance? And then post-market surveillance, how are you going to manage that? And obviously, this could be interesting. Again, as Andrew was alluding to, the differences between the UK kind of being more aligned to the old MDD regulations versus the new MDR, which changes classification of devices and requires expanded reach in your post-market surveillance program. You're probably going to want to go ahead and align yourself to the bigger requirements if it's possible and feasible for you. That will streamline your processes outside of the UK later. And then certainly as the UK regulators start to work towards alignment back, hopefully, to some of those EU regulations. And somebody had asked about MDSAP earlier, same story, try to pick the biggest common denominators, work on those first, and then make sure your systems are set up to accommodate the differences and the nuances across the various markets that you'll be dealing with. So as far as help, we've got a UKCA marking pathway white paper available on our website. And I'm not sure, I'll have to ask Kieran if we're going to include this with the slides. If not, we can sure send you the link to go get this guide that we've put together to help you guys figure this out. And again, using 13485 as your guide, this really will position you best from a bigger picture perspective, not just the single market of the UK, because as most of us know, generally, we usually have much bigger marketing plans than just one market. And so as you start to implement your quality systems, the thinking in that bigger picture will help you get there a lot faster, even if it takes you a little bit longer to set it up at the beginning. So technical documentation, product lifecycle and documentation. So as you're going through your development process, figuring out all the requirements and things you need to meet to get your documentation together for that placement into the market. We show here a really great sort of breakdown of the various steps and places that you've got to plan and get your documents together. And obviously, back in that research and early development phase, your regulatory strategy is absolutely key to drive all of this, because once you've established the markets you're going into and what those market requirements are, then you can make sure that you have included the various requirements into your design and development processes, so that you don't get all the way to the end and figure out that you missed something big and important, slows you down later, cause all sorts of problems when you go to try to get that tech file through the regulatory authorities. You want to streamline that as much as possible. And the best way to do that is to plan well and make sure you've got that strategy laid out upfront from the beginning. Technical documentation, what you'll need. Andrew, walk us through this.
Thank you. Okay, so yeah, again, very much like with EU compliance as well. So technical file, technical documentation is a compilation of the documents that are needed to contain all the relevant information about a device. It includes performance and safety, and it's used to demonstrate compliance with the requirements within the UK MDR. So all the main sections here are covered. Broadly speaking, there's different ways of different sources of information for what should be included in a technical file, but we generally find still that actually the EU MDR, Annex 2 of the MDR and Annex 2 of the IVDR provides quite a good overview of what should be in a technical file. So, while it's not applicable in Great Britain, it's still quite a useful guide for what should be in there. And this structure follows that format as well. So it starts off with basic information about understanding the device, how it's manufactured, the classification, and so on in a device description. Provides all the labeling, IFU, user manuals, everything that's supplied to the user or with the device, for using the device. Goes into sort of thorough overview of the design and manufacturing information, links to the design and development file if there is one, provides an overview of the manufacturing process, any manufacturing validations, IQ, PQ reports, and so on. Then essential requirements checklist. So again, very much like GSPR checklists that you now have in the EU MDR and IVDR, but obviously to the requirements of Annex 1 of the previous EU medical device directives. Then there's also a requirement to have information about risk. So usually the risk management file, best to have it in accordance with the standards on risk management, ISO 14971, the 2019 version. And then the sections on product verification and validation, usually the bigger section here, and can cover quite a few different areas, like some of the examples we've got, biological evaluations, to ISO 10993, stability testing, electrical safety testing, to IEC 60601, and so on. You've got specifics like usability, software validation if your device has software, and one of the most critical parts of this section is the clinical evaluation. I'll go into that more in the next slide. And also there's a requirement to have information on post-market surveillance, so post-market surveillance plan and post-market clinical follow-up if it's required. But again, as I was saying before, it's best to think of these as the same requirements as the old directives. So requirements on PMCF and PMS in general are somewhat less strict than you're looking at for the EU MDR at this point. But yeah, if you go to the next slide, have a sort of more specific look at the clinical evaluation, because it's such an important part. And if you have an approved body review, there's a good chance that the technical documentation review will focus quite heavily on the clinical evaluation, very much again like you would do for CE marking. So the clinical evaluation is quite a big part of it, and starts off with determination of state of the art. So since performance and safety are both essentially relative terms, clinical evaluation really needs to have a thorough review of what the state of the art is in treating or diagnosing that relevant medical condition. And that's used as a benchmark against which your device is then measured. And as the name suggests, clinical evaluation should be based on a review of clinical data. So that's data from the use of the device on human patients as well. So yeah, there's different sources that these data can be obtained. Usually the first place to look is if the device can be demonstrated to be equivalent to other devices. And if there's data published on those other devices, those equivalent devices, they can be leveraged for supporting the clinical safety and performance of your device. And one of the bigger changes with the MDD, EU MDD to MDR transition was making it strict, tougher to demonstrate equivalence. So this can be quite a more useful area to progress with under the EU MDR than it potentially is now with the UK MDR than it is now with the EU MDR. After that, then there's potentially clinical studies and clinical investigations could be used to collect data following GCP. So 14155 is obviously relevant there. And as an output of clinical evaluation, there's potentially the need for specific post-market surveillance or post-market clinical follow-up studies to be performed to fill any gaps. And one thing to mention at the end, it is sometimes possible to justify why clinical data might not be needed, and it's based on the risks of the product, any claim was made, and probably most importantly, the level of patient interaction. So this is obviously much more relevant route forward for something where it has very little patient contact, like the denture cleaning brush, I always use that as an example, and much less so for something like an implant, where it's obviously clinical data is much harder to do without. So if we go to the next slide, we'll look at UK approved bodies. So for everything other than the lowest class device, UK approved body is required. So after the QMS and technical documentation in place, then a review with an approved body can begin. So like I say, it's needed for all devices except for class 1, non-sterile and non-measuring and general IVDs as well. In practice, the notified body, the approved body would be chosen well before the QMS and technical documentation are ready, so that the assessments can be booked in ahead of time. At this point, there's only these 4 approved bodies within the UK, and the 2 on the right have relatively limited scopes, so can't cover all different device types. But according to the MHRA, there's quite a few other approved bodies going through the application process. So we expect that number to increase in future. However, at this point, all 4 of these, 3 of these 4 other than UL, are also parts of companies that are notified bodies as well. So with the big push on getting the devices approved under the EU MDR and EU IVDR, there's quite a scarcity of resource within these approved bodies at this point. So something to bear in mind when looking to plan out the UKCA activities. And on to the next section. So once the notified body, the approved body review has been completed, the manufacturer can sign the UK MDR declaration of conformity and can place UKCA mark on the device. But if the manufacturer is based outside of the UK, then they'll need a UK responsible person, the UKRP, and it's the responsibility of the UKRP to register the device with the MHRA. Otherwise, if the manufacturer is based within the UK, they can register the device directly. And then the next slide, we'll look at the specifics for Northern Ireland. So as I mentioned before, it generally follows the requirements for the EU, so the EU MDR and the EU IVDR. There's a few areas of difference. So the MHRA, the UK Medical Device Competent Authority, is still the competent authority for devices placed on the Northern Ireland market. But what else we got? And other than that, it's mostly the same. There's still requirements to register most devices with the MHRA. And a quick note to make about the UKNI mark. So this is a addition to the CE mark on a device if the device has been the device requires a third-party conformity assessment to a notified body for CE marking. And if the manufacturer has chosen a UK notified body to do this, and bear in mind, say notified body, not approved body, then a UK NI mark is needed next to the CE mark. But at the moment, there's no UK notified bodies, and arguably it's unlikely that there will be any UK notified bodies in future. So essentially, for medical devices at least, the UK NI mark is somewhat largely redundant. So yes, it's interesting to sort of bear it in mind, but it's probably of limited use to consider in future. So going on from that, we've got the future changes. So I think we discussed these a little bit before. So the UK government is in a process of implementing some changes to the UK MDR. Last year they launched a consultation procedure consultation process where they asked stakeholders of their opinions on some proposed changes to the UK MDR. And in June this year, the UK government published their findings on that consultation procedure. So most of the changes that were published were proposals to cover the general goals of improved patient safety and fostering innovation within the UK. And specific changes that were proposed were, broadly speaking, of a similar type to the ones that you would have seen occurring with the change from the EU MDD to the MDR. So things like looking at new classification rules, a bigger focus on software in particular, heightened post-market surveillance requirements, broadening the scope of the regulations to cover devices without a medical purpose, and other things like UDI as well. So potentially, to be determined, within the next few years, we might see something of realignment of the regulatory requirements in Great Britain with those in the EU. So they're the proposals at this point, and the government seem to be planning on adopting them, but yeah, they're due for implementation July 2024. So between now and then, we'll surely get some more information on that. And I think that's that for future changes. So I'll pass it back over to Kelly to talk about timings and tactics.
Thank you, Andrew. So how long does all this take? That's always the burning question, right? Especially if you're a startup and you've got investors, or maybe you have a board and stockholders. They always want to know, when can we start selling product? So obviously, the best way for you to get to market fastest is to start from a good, solid regulatory strategy, because that will help you define what you need to do along the way to make it all work. So I've seen it take a couple of months, and I've seen it take years. It's definitely dependent on your product, the complexity, and of course, how well you've defined your requirements based on your product classification, etc. So again, how is your device classified? What clinical or preclinical data requirements do you have? Those things drive timelines and also sync timelines very quickly. You want to make sure you've got a good, solid approach there. If there's existing devices in the market, you've got a solid argument for equivalency. And again, keeping in mind all the various states of transition that the regulations are in from a worldview, there is definitely opportunity there to hopefully align yourself a little bit to coming changes, et cetera, and engaging your regulators early and asking lots of questions as you go through the process is always a good strategy. You definitely want to start your long-term work as early as possible. So things like your aging, your stability evaluation, your biological evaluation, in vivo, etc., clinical studies, and interacting with the approved bodies that you plan to deal with, again, early, ask lots of questions, really be transparent, try to help formulate it as a partnership so that you can establish that good working relationship, have good communication, and hopefully get through the process with as few unexpected pop-ups as possible. When should you start with your quality system? When should you start with your quality related documentation? There's a lot of different thoughts out there for this. I'm biased to as soon as possible, and I'll talk about that here in a second. But we've got a couple ideas for you and things that we've seen. So the linear approach, waterfall, right? So you generate lots of things and then go through a design review, or start from the beginning with get your quality system in place, get your quality system certified, then start working on your technical documentation. This is a little bit of a slower approach from a time to market and where your focus is, especially if you're resource constrained. The smart thing about this, however, is that you won't have to go back and redo any documentation, because if you're doing it according to established processes from the beginning, then by the time you get to doing your tech file, your documents are already solid and they're already governed by an existing QMS that should, in theory, streamline your work through the approval process, as well as getting your tech file together. That's a bit of a blue sky approach. I haven't seen that very often. Usually what I see is sort of model 2. So you've already got prototypes, partially developed products, and then once you've figured out that this product is actually viable, then you start building your quality system as you go along. And so from an advantages perspective, the part of prototyping and partial development, you've got a viable product, but you're not spending any money on your quality management system yet, because again, that takes some money and some resource effort. The downside of this is that once you start establishing your quality system, I see a lot of rework in documentation happen with this methodology, because often, this model is often run by the innovator of the products without input from a quality person, or sometimes, hopefully, maybe even a regulatory person. I've seen products get this far with folks building prototypes and engineering, and then they go, oh yeah, we need this quality system to get through all of this, and they don't realize or understand what that means from a documentation perspective. And so it often slows them down to have to go back and redo certain elements of your supporting records before you are even able to think about getting a tech file in front of a reviewer. So faster approach, lean, agile, do these things in parallel. Have your quality system, start with the important pieces like doc control and design control. Get those processes established upfront, and then you can continue to have your product development processes happening in parallel. And this really, someone asked a question actually about, do you have recommendations on doing this electronically versus doing this on paper? Of course, we are all about the no paper here at Qualio. Paper is never leaner or more efficient. And in the long run, you'll end up spending more time changing over than if you would just start electronically from the beginning. So I talk a lot about, you might have to slow down now in order to speed up later. But that's important to consider, because if you have to redo documentation before you can get it submitted, you're wasting time. And if you had done it in a compliant manner from the beginning, you'd be going a lot faster. So again, what we see in this sort of parallel approach with getting your quality system up and running so that you can be capturing the necessary items as you go through your product realization process is that you save a lot of time to register and launch your product later, especially if you can go about getting certified in this parallel process as things are going along. And in this sort of lean methodology where you're doing a lot more smaller sprints of work and then hitting those design review phases, you'll find that you're going to have actually faster development cycles, and you've built continuous quality into the product instead of considering it as an afterthought later when the regulators ask, well, what are your quality control points? What are your critical control points? You didn't consider that in the development process because you didn't have a quality system telling you needed to do so. So definitely highly recommend start working on that QMS even as you're working through your product processes. It really will save you time in the long run. As far as more tips and best practices, yeah, I can't emphasize enough that paper is not your friend here. We've got some data that estimates that even small organizations with a heavy paper-oriented operation spend at least $25,000 a year on paper production and usage costs. And this can rise as high as $175,000 a year for larger operations. You don't realize how much time it takes, and you're paying a person to chase paper around your facility. That's all waste. That's all time wasted. You've got to have controls around the paper that require physical space, fireproof cabinets, all of this craziness that goes along with managing paper. And in this day and age where a lot of companies are virtual, it's really not even possible to manage paper in a virtual environment. You know, there's a lot of options out there, but none of them are as efficient as a built for purpose QMS tool to help you gather all this documentation. In the digital world that's automated, again, you can keep track of things quickly, easily, see who's approved, who still needs to approve. You know, it doesn't require any space in your facility if you're cloud-based, of course. And, you know, the traceability, version control, et cetera, is all baked in to a good solid QMS tool. So you don't have to build processes around it just to support the moving of the paper. And then searching. If you've ever had to go find some little piece of information out of somebody's lab notebook stashed in a file cabinet somewhere, you'll know that that's not a good use of anybody's time. So as far as, you know, options around QMS, again, more numbers and this will all be shared out to you later. Happy to provide links to where some of this information comes from if you have questions about that. But again, you know, paper is not the efficient way forward here. And I know a lot of times in the startup space, justifying the cost of another software tool can also be difficult. But if you just look at the paper costs alone, and then you add on top of that the time loss, because time is money in the time to market, it's usually pretty easy to justify the spend on a QMS tool. You should definitely consider digitizing wherever possible. And so in this case study that we are presenting, we've got, you know, again, a mixture of standards, and they ditched their paper QMS and mitigated 3 FTE salaries from the bottom line based on their estimates of managing the paper. The quality task completion timeline was cut by 90%. That's a huge number. But as you know, if you're trying to route paper around to get everybody to sign and approve, that can be very difficult. And again, it's a big time sink. And so achieving 13485 accreditation and MHRA approval within 3 months. It is very possible to move these things along at a very good clip if you've got a well-organized, lean quality management system that gathers all the important facts and figures right in your system right there. Documentation's everything. Document. We joke all the time over here, you know, and I don't know if it's as common in Europe and the UK, but as we always say here, if you don't write it down, it didn't happen. And that's still definitely true in this scenario as well. From a document management perspective, you want to choose your lifecycle strategy with that linear incremental approach, set your processes up to support that, and choosing the approved body that you work with. Also very important, very important. You want to make sure that they have some experience in your therapeutic area, if possible. Otherwise, you might have to do a lot of educating, and that's okay, but you should plan for that in your processes. And then as far as technical documentation, choosing your classification carefully, again, coming back to this regulatory and clinical strategy for your products. Ensure that you've covered all the relevant sections. Check for consistency, especially with that intended purpose of the device. I've seen those written well and things sail through. I've seen those written less well, can really cause some serious delays as you go through the process. Ensure the information is clearly presented, that it's searchable, it's bookmarked, all of this in your files. Ensure the content is properly explained. For example, which products are covered by which tests. If you've got a complex product, you'll want to make sure that's very clear in how you've laid all of this out. Ensure that the justification for why testing was conducted the way it was, sample size, product type tested, what standards are you, applying to your products, and then your clinical evaluation should cover all parts of the intended purpose, indications, and patient population. Don't be afraid of audits. It's always interesting to me to have conversations with folks about audits and how these things go. Get to know your auditor a little bit. If you can find out who they're going to be ahead of time, open that communication line as soon as possible. Provide your justifications for non-applicability for those sections. Make sure that they're, thorough and thorough but concise, I guess. Too many words can make it muddy, so you want to be sure you manage that well. Gap analysis is always a great tool to cover all your elements. And then using your international standards and guidelines for your implementation. Use the right terminology. As soon as you get into a situation of needing to translate how you do business to how the standards are written, you are now in a situation of risk. And so wherever you can align your systems to the language the standards use, the methodologies in those standards, that is always should be your first choice. There are absolutely situations where maybe those don't align, but be prepared to explain them if you're in a translation situation. Keep your records current, complete. Again, this is easier to do in an electronic system because you've got the system and the processes driving activities around that documentation, where if it's on paper, it's very easy for those things to get lost and become out of date. Keep up with your internal changes. Be sure you're assessing change, including, again, risk, impact, always risk to patient, impact to the product, etc. Verify the consistency across technical documentation. Are your intended purpose for perform claims traceable? Are they backed with data? It's amazing to me as well how often I've seen people make therapeutic claims about their products but don't actually have a study that proves that. Make sure, again, part of your initial regulatory strategy, if some of that is comparison to another product, that you have actual real data to back that up. And then be sure that all of that information is provided to the auditor as you go along. And in an electronic QMS, this is actually all very, very easy. All right, so we've got about 10 minutes and we have a lot of questions. So thank you guys so much. This is great, love to see it. So I'm just gonna start from the beginning and roll on down. Will RUO devices require registration in the UK similar to medical devices? Andrew, do you have any?
I was looking at that one. I've not heard that acronym before, RUO devices. If you could add that, we work in acronyms most of the time, but if you can let us know what that is, and we can answer that one.
Yeah, that would be great. What harmonizing efforts are in place at this time between the EU, UK, and the US?
So I think most, from what I can tell, it's mostly a one-way street at the moment. So I don't think the US or the EU are particularly looking to try and, I may not have just heard about this, but not looking to try and find a way for sort of UK or Great Britain approved devices to have an easier access into either the EU or the US. But I think the other way around is much more the case. So one of the proposals for the new UK MDR is that approved bodies and the MHRA would be able to look at approvals in other territories, like US 510K or CE certification in the EU, and consider those when it comes to UKCA marking a device in Great Britain. So yeah, I think it's definitely that way around. I'm not sure about the other way.
Okay. The UK MDR is published now, correct? Out there on.
It is. It's not necessarily the easiest thing to navigate. Not quite nice. One nice document like the EU legislation. So there is the UK MDR that's published, and there's lots of references in there to the annexes in the directives. So normally what I would do is still have a copy of the good old-fashioned EU MDD, IVDD, and active implantable directive as well to look at those for the main issues. But the list of changes has been published that's relevant to the UK MDR. So the type of ones I listed before, approved bodies instead of notified bodies, UKRPs instead of authorized reps, and so on and so forth. So yeah, that's probably the most relevant thing to look at in the UK MDR text itself.
Okay. I've read that DNV Norway was approved for UKCA. Is that not true?
Yeah, I was looking at this one. So the MHRA have got a list of all the approved bodies, much like there's the NANDO list for notified bodies in the EU. So from what I can see, they're not listed there. I think DNV are a approved body, but it's for other legislation, like like in the EU, you have notified bodies for machinery directive or any other sort of legislation that requires a notified body, but it has to be legislation specific. So from what I can tell, DNV aren't an approved body for medical devices at this point, but they might be applying for it. I'm not sure.
Okay. UK responsible person is residents outside the UK. Okay.
Yep. That's straightforward.
Yep. Okay. How open to software agile development methods are the UK reviewers?
That's interesting. I mean, bear in mind that UK reviewers are essentially, we've got UL who aren't a notified body, but their scope for approval is just IVDs. So potentially what we're talking about, maybe, I suppose, we have IVD software. I'm less familiar with those, but yeah, it's essentially the same as they would be for accepting methods like that for CE marking as well. So generally with software, yeah, they look at sort of state-of-the-art development methods, and if you can demonstrate that the agile method is that, then yeah, our experience generally that it's well received. But yeah, it's a much bigger topic than we can cover just now. So
it is indeed. Yeah, as I say, it's been my experience that they're absolutely open to whatever methodology you're using, as long as you have the appropriate controls defined within your development process and your procedures. So I don't see a reason why they wouldn't be open to that, because as long as you're still meeting the requirements and you're still considering risk to patient as you go through that process, I don't see why that would be a problem. For virtual reality and augmented reality type of devices, will the new regulations apply to these? Any insights so far?
Oh, interesting. I haven't. So yeah, that's what we were talking about before. I haven't seen anything specifically about that. There's a focus on with the new. Well, we've got the current regulations in the UK, so the current UK MDR. So same scope as would have applied before, same definition of medical device as we had under the EU MDD. Yeah, there's been sort of a specific focus on novel technology within the proposals for the new rules under the UK MDR. I don't remember seeing anything about augmented reality or anything like that. Big focus on software and new technologies in general. So yeah, I wouldn't be surprised if there's sort of a specific focus there. In terms of, did we have something in there about whether the scope would change and AR devices that aren't covered already might be included? Yeah, there's parts of it looking at the scope of the UK MDR changing. So very much like with the EU MDR, the scope changed to include devices that weren't previously regulated as medical devices. But yeah, that could be a change now as well. But we'll find out within the next sort of 6 months, I think, what more specifics on those changes will be.
Awesome, thank you. What if the devices have already been on the EU market? Does the 2-year period still start with the first granting of the UK marketing authorization, or can we just do PSURs annually?
Okay, interesting.
PSUR guidance states, if you have just been granted a UK marketing authorization, usually you need to submit your PSUR every 6 months until the product is placed on the market, every 6 months for the first 2 years after the product is placed on the market, and then once a year for the following 2 years.
Okay. So sorry, were you looking at a separate question in there? So okay.
Yeah, so well, I was just, so it's the same person that just listed the PSUR guidance that I just read off about the every 6 months till you're on the market, et cetera, et cetera. This is, I guess, from the PSUR guidance. And then they go on to ask, what if the devices have already been on the EU market? Does the 2-year period still start with the first granting of the UK marketing authorization, or can we just do the PSURs annually?
Oh, interesting. Okay, so reading between the lines, if the product's been approved in the EU and the sort of frequency of the PSURs has been started with that, then if there's a subsequently UKCA approval after that, whether that changes the frequency or sort of starts that. If that's what the question is, I'd say bear in mind there's currently no requirement for PSURs under the UK MDR. So there's still requirement for PMS reports, and the UK MDR and therefore the EU MDD was much less specific about the frequency of needing to do PMS reports. So I'd say based on that, obviously every case is individual. If you've got a sort of standard frequency for PSURs that's already been set by the CE marking the device and the timescales there, I'd say that would probably sort of, there wouldn't necessarily be any automatic need to change that frequency or that timescale, when the UK device has been approved as well, mostly due to the flexibility in the timescales for PMS under the UK MDR. I may have misunderstood the question, but I think that might be the way I look at it.
Okay. And I think, okay, let's see. I'm going to go with last question here because we're just about out of time. But would the UK regulators accept unscripted testing as part of validation for non-high-risk features in software as a medical device? I'm going to take a quick stab at this one and say that the new guidances around software validation, as published by GAMP, as well as some of the other stuff coming out of the FDA, does not apply to software as a medical device. Those apply to supporting tools. And that is where we see, the CSA to CSV approach, which is what I think you're getting at with this question. I'm sure unscripted testing is absolutely useful tool in medical device software development, but I don't think, unless you can present good arguments as to risk associated, etc., there are still tighter requirements around validation activities for software as a medical device and software embedded in medical devices than there are around activities such as your EQMS validation, for example, where the notion of accepting outputs from the software development lifecycle and doing unscripted testing is absolutely acceptable in that situation. All right. Looks like there's a few others kind of rolling in. We will try to get to these via email. And there was one person asking a few times about Qualio for automated validation. We've got some great white paper resources for that on our website, because we are using an approach with our EQMS tool, but again, that is different than medical device software. So I would encourage you to check out our website, and we can get that information to you. Thank you so much, everyone. Great questions, great conversation, good engagement. We will be providing the slides to you after in a follow-up email, and do feel free to reach out if you have any other questions. Thank you. Have a great day.